Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Katie Yoga Australia Sunday. I'm Katie.
I'm Dave.
Big shout out to all of our listeners out there. Thank you so much for your support, your continued support for our YouTube and our podcast.
Absolutely. Today's discussion is, Katie?
Yoga Props, dumbing down our yoga practice.
If you would like to know more about us, though, before we get into that, then have a look at our website. It's in the description below. And in that website, you'll see our bricks and mortar studio. You can have a read about who we are and subscribe for access to our online content. All the episodes that we're seeing here are also available on podcast. They come through on Spotify and also Apple Podcasts. It makes a perfect way to learn as you commute in your daily life. To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe or follow this community channel. Even go over to the website and join our mailing list to receive emails for upcoming workshops, promotions, and things like that. Remember, become part of the Katie Yoga community. So let's dive in, shall we, Katie?
Yeah.
Are yoga props dumbing down our practice? First question. You ready?
Yes.
Okay. So, yoga props, what's the intent of these things?
Well, they really link in with the Iyengar lineage. Iyengar really promoted the use of props. And if you're not familiar with Iyengar, it's an alignment-based practice lineage that comes from Iyengar was a student of Krishnamacharya's, who's considered the father of modern yoga, and a lot of Krishnamacharya's students were really pivotal in bringing yoga to the West. And from what I understand, Iyengar was working with Westerners and saw that Westerners' bodies were quite different from Indians' bodies, and so brought in the use of props to help to adapt and modify the postures to make them more accessible for people, so practitioners could find more space, more ease, more expansion, and more ideal alignment in the postures.
Awesome.
Yeah, so nowadays props are still used in that way, but they also have a lot more versatility and ways that we can use them in our practice, because we're pulling so much in the yoga world from exercise science. So there's a lot more different ways that we tend to use props. So for example, blocks are great. Blocks are great if you want to extend your arms. So say if you're doing triangle pose, which is a standing pose, and one arm reaches towards the earth and you can't quite reach the ground without folding forward and squishing yourself into the pose, you can use
that brings back memories.
you can bring a block under your hand to give you some height. Or you could in a lunge, you can put blocks under the hands to give you more space for the hips, or if you're in a standing forward bend, blocks under the hands. Blocks are also really good for passive holds too. So if you're in bridge pose, you can wedge a couple of blocks.
Oh, that's right. We did a session on how high on whether it works. Yeah, go back and have a look at that. That was a good one.
Yeah. So and we can also use the blocks under the shoulders or the scapula, the shoulder blades, and perhaps under the head for fish pose as well. So there are a couple of examples of where you might use blocks to help create a shape that you want to be in, and then you can just relax into that shape. Yeah. Another great way to use blocks is myofascial release.
Okay.
It's a bit of a beastly one. I often do it in class. You can use a foam roller and it's much better because it doesn't have corners. But laying down and releasing under the armpit area, so you're releasing into serratus and lats. And then if you lean forward, you're releasing into pec. So blocks can be quite fun with that as well.
Awesome.
Other ways we can use props is to load up, to build strength. So there's a little bit of weight to them, so we can add that weight to increase the intensity.
Okay.
So for example, if you're doing locust pose and lying on your belly with your palms facing the ground, and you can grab hold of the blocks, one in each hand, and as you lift into the back bend, lift the blocks up as well. So just working at your shoulders, in your shoulder, posterior shoulder strength a little bit more. And I like to squeeze in the shoulder blades in that one and draw the shoulder blades down to really sort of work rhomboids and lower traps with a little bit of extra load.
Yep.
Other ways we can work with blocks is I like to stand on them.
Oh, yeah, I've done this one.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways you can work this. So you can stand and work on strengthening. So one leg's on the block. You can work on strengthening that standing leg, hip stabilizer, the outer hip. But you can also work another way of just letting the hovering leg dangle, and that will add some traction to release the hip flexor.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is just blocks.
Yeah. I mean, and when you go to yoga, you go into the prop room and there's a whole plethora of different types of props that you can use, and they all usually get used. They're not like they just sit there gathering dust.
So
that's the interesting part about it.
Yeah, so I guess to summarize that, we can use blocks to lengthen the arm so we can create more space and ease in the posture. We can use it as load to create strength, and we can also use it to create release and length in the body.
Okay.
Pretty versatile.
You're right. So in this episode, we're just talking about blocks generally, or?
Yeah, I was just going to leave it at blocks.
Yeah, I think so, because then we can move on to the others if everyone's got any questions about them down the track.
Yeah.
Great thinking. Can we become too much reliant on yoga props?
Do they become a crutch?
Yeah.
Does a yoga mat become a crutch? That's a prop.
Well, that's a point.
So, from what I understand, back in the day, they used to not have yoga mats and they'd practice on wood floors.
Yes.
Can you imagine how slippery that could potentially be?
Well, particularly if they were hiring a dance hall and they used to put wax on the wood to make it slippery to dance on. So I can really see how that'd be a problem if you weren't activating in your posture.
Yeah, so you'd have to activate the legs a lot more, I would presume, and also perhaps shorten your stance so you wouldn't be necessarily going into those really long, deep end range positions. Otherwise, you just fall into the split.
Ouch.
Perhaps, yeah. So I would presume it was shorter stance, more leg activation.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, is a yoga props a crutch? Is, like, think about everything, technology and advancements we've had. Is a bed a crutch because we're more comfortable lying in a bed than on the ground? So does society need to toughen up and do with less? You know, I think all of this technology it's about giving us more freedom, more time, more ease, and that is really what part of our yoga practice is about.
But it's also a nice way to start a practice without having to worry about injury and things like that when you're trying to achieve things.
As a beginner.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but also the whole way through your practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you don't need to stop using props.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And I think it's all about that. We've talked about this before about the practice being really body centric. So being able to use the props to be able to support the body in the shape rather than trying to force the body into a particular shape that isn't necessarily going to be kind and helpful for the body.
So should we try and work towards not using them? I think we kind of answered that.
Yeah, no, there's so many good ways to use them. There's so many great ways to use them. And maybe we do stop using them for certain things. Like if you're taking, for example, Paschimottanasana, which is straight leg seated forward bend, where we might prop up with a blanket to help encourage a little bit more tilt at the hips to come into the forward bend. So it's not so much lumbar bend, lower back bend. It's coming from the hips. There are a little bit of blanket can help with that. And over time, we might get to the stage where the hamstrings are a little bit longer and we can bend more easily and we don't necessarily need the blanket. But then we might stop yoga for a few months and do a lot of running and then the hamstrings tighten up. So I think it's understanding that the body is constantly changing as well, day to day as well, morning to night.
Yeah, and as you said, what activities you do during the day and things like that, it can all make a big difference.
Yeah, and with the blocks and being changing up and chopping and changing our practice, and not just blocks, but any yoga props, I think variability is really, really good. The body responds really well to the different stresses we apply to it. It helps the body adapt and become more resilient. If we do the same thing all of the time, it might have had benefits at the start, but we don't really get as much benefit later on. So it's really good to chop and change things as we progress with our practice, and that's where props can really, really keep the practice new and interesting and different. And there's so many ways we can use props, and there's so many, which I gave the example with blocks, but there's so many different props that are now integrated into practice, and And, you know, some of the stuff we use are resistance bands
Yes.
to build strength, or weights. We actually have little hand weights that we use in class. And then all the myofascial release things that we do. So we talked about the block, but it's actually nice to have a foam roller as well that
Yeah,
rolls.
and a ball.
And the trigger balls, yeah.
The trigger balls, they work really, really well.
I don't think the students would call it nice, but but you get some great results. Actually, we've got a myofascial release workshop coming up in a couple of weeks, which will be fun.
Absolutely. So don't forget, guys, keep the questions coming in. We've just touched on, you know, using blocks and things like that.
So, and I think it's a really good question, our props, dumbing down our yoga practice. So my answer is no. I think they're fantastic because you can use them to create more challenge and intensity. You can use them to create more space and ease, and you can use them to create more body awareness. Another way to use blocks I forgot to mention is just popping it between the thighs in Tadasana and squeezing and feel that engagement of the legs.
Yeah.
It's just another way to connect the mind with the body and increase that body awareness. And I think rather than thinking is something dumbing down the practice, maybe look at what is bringing you to the state of yoga and what is taking you away from the state of yoga. So what the kleshas are taking, which I won't go into detail, but they're things that take us away from a yogic state, where the kleshas are taking us towards a yogic state. And that should be more of a focus in our practices rather than whether we're using the props or not.
Yeah,
How do we feel at
absolutely.
the end of the practice? Are we able to more easily watch this internal state that's changing and connect with that internal state within us that's not changing and drop into that state of yoga.
It's nice to keep in mind too that, you know, the asana, the postures, which we use the blocks for and things, is only 1/8 of the 8 limbs of yoga.
And they're the tool to take us into the state of yoga, giving us something to focus on. And so then the practice becomes a meditation. It becomes the body's a concentration point, a focal point,
Yeah.
alambana, which is then bringing us into that state of meditation, which is that state of yoga.
Beautiful. So anything else you'd like to add into that? That's about covered it, do you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
Unless we've got anything that you guys have questions about that we've spoken.
Just a reminder, we do have a question and answer session coming up down the track. Now, we're waiting for a few more questions to come in, so we've got a few more to ask
Send them
to make
in.
it things. So send them in, put them in the description or the comments section below. You could even email them in if you're, you know, been to the website.
Yeah, I thought we might put up a little box at the studio as well, so people can just write
That's a
them
great
and
idea.
chuck them
Yeah,
into.
Absolutely. Look, if you've enjoyed the discussion, please become one of the Katie Yoga community by liking, subscribing and following. We possibly next week, depending on how our time goes, may not have
A video,
video.
or a podcast, because we're starting a teacher training which runs over the weekend, which is really exciting. It's
we've got a
With
new,
a new
cohort of
group.
students coming through. So
Mm.
yeah, that's really exciting.
yeah.
And that takes a fair bit of focus and attention to get that set up.
Yeah,
So
we've had our previous cohort have just done their prac and they were just amazing. It was
absolutely amazing.
It's part of my favourite part of the teacher training course is being able to go to the classes. And yeah.
Yeah, so keep an eye out on the little notification bell. That is a really good way to know if we've got one that pops up or not, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Perhaps even go over to the newsletter. We'll probably put something out there if we're going to put something up or not, or on our Facebook, to let people know what's happening. And remember, if you do go over and join the newsletter, then the newsletter is once an Australian term. You're not going to get bombarded every day. with-
Sometimes I try to do it monthly,
Monthly?
but then later in the year it tends to be a term every term. So you won't get more than monthly anyway. It's not, you won't get saturated with emails daily.
Yeah, so thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of the week. If you're looking at this Sunday, you've got hours left. And if you're looking at this on any other day of the week, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys.